Sell me one piece of advice, the billionaire said lazily, sliding a crisp $100 bill across the table. And if it's good, you can keep it. The restaurant around him glowed with the quiet confidence of Manhattan money. Crystal glasses catching the warm light of chandeliers. Low conversations drifting between tables where deals worth millions were discussed as casually as the weather. Ethan Caldwell sat at the center of it all, exactly where he was used to being. At 38, he had built a reputation on two things: spotting opportunities before anyone else and enjoying the small games he played with people who underestimated him. Tonight was no different. Across the table, two venture partners watched with amused curiosity as Ethan leaned back in his chair, perfectly tailored navy suit catching the soft golden light. His watch alone cost more than most people's yearly rent. And now his attention had landed on someone he assumed was just background to the evening. Clara Bennett had been working the floor for less than an hour. The new waitress moved through the crowded dining room with calm precision, balancing trays and refilling glasses without ever seeming rushed. Most customers barely noticed her. Ethan did, not because of her uniform or her quiet voice, but because she never once looked intimidated by the room. When she approached his table to refill the water glasses, Ethan lifted his gaze and studied her for a moment, the way he studied potential investments. Observing, calculating, curious. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth and casual. Clara paused politely, pitcher in hand. "Yes, sir." Ethan tapped the folded bill on the white tablecloth. "Let's make this interesting. Sell me your best advice. 30 seconds. If it's worth hearing, the 100 is yours." One of his partners chuckled under his breath. Another leaned back, already entertained by the unfolding spectacle. It was the kind of thing Ethan did when he was bored, little social experiments, moments where money created a stage and strangers revealed themselves. Most people stumbled through nervous jokes or overly eager attempts to impress him. Sometimes they tried flattery. Sometimes they froze entirely. Either way, Ethan always won the game. Clara Bennett looked at the bill for exactly 1 second. Then she set the water pitcher gently on the table. The room around them continued moving. The clink of silverware, the soft murmur of conversations, the distant hiss of the kitchen, but something about her stillness made the moment feel strangely quiet. Ethan expected hesitation. He expected a polite laugh or a quick excuse about needing to help another table. Instead, Clara simply met his eyes. Calm, steady, unimpressed. She didn't reach for the money. She didn't rush to answer. For the briefest moment, Ethan felt something he rarely experienced during these games. Curiosity. 30 seconds, he reminded her lightly. Clara tilted her head slightly, as if considering the offer. Then she spoke in a voice so even it barely rose above the restaurant's hum. "If you need to pay someone $100 for wisdom," she said softly, "there's a good chance you ignored it when it was free." The laughter at the table stopped immediately. Ethan Caldwell didn't move. The billionaire who had built an empire reading rooms and predicting outcomes suddenly found himself doing something he hadn't planned on doing tonight. Thinking carefully about what a waitress had just said. For several seconds Ethan Caldwell did not speak. The quiet that followed Clara Bennett's words was not loud or dramatic, but it was noticeable enough that one of the venture partners slowly lowered his wine glass back to the table. Ethan finally leaned forward slightly, his expression no longer amused. He studied her face the way he studied financial reports, looking for weakness, exaggeration, anything that suggested the moment had been luck rather than confidence. But Clara simply stood there, hands loosely folded in front of her apron, her posture relaxed and professional. She did not appear proud of what she had said. She did not appear nervous either. She simply looked like someone waiting to finish her job. One of the men at the table let out a quiet breath. "Well," he said slowly, "that was not what I expected." Ethan's gaze never left Clara. "Neither did I." His voice was calmer now, thoughtful rather than playful. He reached toward the bill on the table and slid it slightly closer to her. "Congratulations. You earned it." Clara glanced at the $100 bill, but did not reach for it immediately. "Thank you, sir," she said politely, though her tone suggested the money had never really been the point. Ethan noticed that. Most people would have grabbed it instantly. Some would have thanked him twice. Others would have started explaining their advice, as if hoping to impress him further. Clara Bennett simply picked up the water pitcher again and began refilling the glasses around the table as if the moment had already passed. The calm efficiency of the movement caught Ethan off guard. She did not linger for praise. She did not try to continue the conversation. When she finished pouring the water, she placed the pitcher back on her tray and finally took the bill, folding it once before sliding it neatly into the small pocket of her apron. "Can I bring anyone another drink?" she asked in the same steady voice she had used before. The question felt almost surreal considering what had just happened. Ethan leaned back again, watching her carefully. "Actually," he said, raising a hand slightly before she could step away, "I have another question." Clara paused. Around them, the restaurant continued moving normally, waiters passing between tables, the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, a quiet jazz piano drifting through the room. But at Ethan's table, every pair of eyes had returned to her. "You gave that answer pretty quickly," Ethan continued. "That kind of response usually comes from experience." Clara met his gaze again, calm as before. "Experience helps with many things, sir." One of the partners chuckled softly. "You sound like a consultant." Clara smiled faintly. "No, sir. Just someone who listens." Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her again. There was something about the way she spoke. The words were simple, but the timing was precise. Deliberate. Controlled. Not the way most people spoke when they were trying to impress someone. It sounded more like someone who was used to discussing serious decisions. "What is your name?" Ethan asked. "Clara Bennett." "How long have you been working here, Clara Bennett?" 3 weeks. That answer raised several eyebrows around the table. Ethan tapped one finger lightly against the edge of the tablecloth. 3 weeks, he repeated. "And yet you talk about wisdom like someone who has spent years studying it." Clara did not respond right away. Instead, she adjusted the glasses on the table with quiet precision, aligning them neatly beside the plates. Only then did she look back at him. "Sometimes people learn a lot before they start serving dinner," she said quietly. For the second time that evening, Ethan Caldwell felt the strange sensation that the person standing in front of him was not who she first appeared to be. For a moment, no one at the table spoke. Ethan Caldwell watched Clara Bennett with the focused attention of a man who had built his entire career on recognizing patterns others ignored. Most conversations in places like this followed predictable rules. Wealth created a certain rhythm. People either tried to impress him, flatter him, or avoid eye contact entirely. Clara Bennett had done none of those things. Instead, she had answered his challenge with a sentence that sounded less like a joke and more like a conclusion she had already tested many times before. Ethan rested his elbow lightly on the table and studied her again. "You said people sometimes learn a lot before they start serving dinner," he said slowly. "That sounds like a story." Clara did not immediately respond. She glanced briefly across the dining room, where another table signaled quietly for service. For a second, it looked like she might excuse herself and walk away from the conversation entirely. But when she looked back at Ethan, her expression was still calm, still professional. "Most people have a story, Mr. Caldwell," she replied. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "You know who I am." Clara gave a small nod. "Your picture appears in the business section often." One of the men at the table chuckled softly. "That is one way to say it. Ethan here is practically a celebrity in finance." Ethan ignored the comment. His attention remained on Clara. "If you read business news," he said, "then you probably know what my company does." "Investment strategy," Clara answered without hesitation. "Technology infrastructure, renewable energy portfolios, and recently several acquisitions in healthcare analytics." The table went quiet again. One of the partners slowly turned his head toward Ethan. "She is not guessing," the man murmured. Ethan did not smile, but the corner of his mouth moved slightly. "That is accurate," he said. "Most people would have stopped at investment strategy." Clara did not react to the subtle compliment. She simply adjusted the tray in her hands and waited. Ethan noticed that too. Most people reacted when they received approval from him. Clara Bennett treated the moment like any other part of her shift. "Tell me something, Clara," Ethan continued, his voice thoughtful now. "If you follow investment news closely enough to list sectors like that, why are you working here?" It was a direct question, the kind that usually made people uncomfortable. But Clara did not appear surprised. She considered the question the way someone might consider the temperature outside before answering. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "life rearranges the order of things." One of the partners leaned forward slightly. "That sounds like the beginning of a long explanation." Clara shook her head gently. "Not necessarily." Ethan tapped his finger lightly against the edge of his glass. "You gave me a piece of advice a moment ago," he said. And I am curious about something. Clara waited. Most people who speak that confidently about wisdom, Ethan continued, either studied it in a classroom or paid a high price learning it the hard way. He paused for a moment, watching her reaction. Which one was it for you? Clara Bennett looked at him with the same calm expression she had held since the conversation began. The faint smile that appeared on her face was not proud or defensive. It looked almost reflective. Both, she said softly. That single word hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair, his curiosity now fully awake. Because for the first time that evening, he had the strange feeling that the most interesting person in the room was not sitting at the table with the million-dollar deals. It was the waitress holding the tray. Clara Bennett did not rush to fill the silence after that single word. Both. The answer hung in the air with a quiet weight that made the men at Ethan Caldwell's table glance at one another. It was not dramatic. It was not defensive. It simply sounded like the truth. Ethan watched her carefully, the way he watched a chart that did not behave the way it should. Most people, when they realized they had captured his attention, began talking more. They explained themselves. They filled the air with details and opinions. Clara Bennett did something different. She waited. The faint music from the restaurant's piano drifted across the room, blending with the soft clink of glasses and distant laughter from another table. Ethan finally broke the silence. Both, he repeated slowly. That sounds like an expensive education. Clara gave a small nod. Some lessons cost more than tuition. One of the venture partners leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the unexpected turn of the evening. You know, Ethan, he said with a grin, this is the most interesting dinner conversation we have had in months. Ethan ignored him. His attention was still fixed on Clara. Tell me something, he said, his tone thoughtful now rather than playful. You mentioned reading the business section. Most people read headlines and move on. You listed sectors. That suggests a deeper interest. Clara adjusted the tray slightly in her hands. Interest is free, she replied. Understanding takes time. Ethan noticed again the way she answered questions. No hesitation. No attempt to impress. Just short sentences that landed exactly where they needed to. It reminded him of analysts he had hired years ago, the kind who spoke carefully because they understood the cost of being wrong. Did you study finance? Ethan asked. Clara tilted her head slightly. For a while. College? One of the partners asked. Clara nodded once. Yes. Ethan leaned forward slightly. And yet you are working as a waitress in Manhattan. Clara smiled faintly, but it was not the kind of smile people use to hide embarrassment. It looked more like patience. Life rarely follows the schedule we write for it, she said. The partner who had been watching quietly finally spoke. That sounds like something someone says after a company collapses. Clara's eyes moved toward him for the first time. Sometimes companies collapse, she said calmly. Sometimes people simply step away before they do. Ethan felt something shift in his thoughts at that sentence. He had spent more than 15 years studying markets, watching businesses rise and fall like tides. People inside those companies often saw warning signs long before the headlines appeared, but very few of them walked away early. That required something unusual, judgment, or courage. Ethan rested his hands together on the table and studied her again. You speak like someone who has sat in more boardrooms than dining rooms, he said. Clara did not deny it. Instead, she glanced again across the restaurant floor where another table was beginning to signal for service. Duty first. Conversation second. Ethan recognized that discipline immediately. I should return to my other tables, she said politely. Ethan raised a hand slightly before she turned away. One more question. Clara paused again. Ethan looked at her with a quiet curiosity that had completely replaced the amusement from earlier. Earlier tonight, he said, you told me that wisdom is often ignored. When it is free. He leaned back slightly. That sounds less like philosophy and more like experience. Clara Bennett looked at him for a moment, and for the first time that evening there was the faintest hint of something deeper behind her calm expression. Not pride, not regret, just memory. Experience usually arrives before people are ready to hear it, she said softly. And somehow the way she said it made Ethan Caldwell wonder exactly what kind of boardroom a waitress had once walked away from. Clara Bennett turned slightly as if preparing to leave the table, but Ethan Caldwell's mind was already moving several steps ahead. In business, he had learned that moments like this were rare. Sometimes the most valuable information appeared disguised as something ordinary. A quiet sentence, An unusual observation. A person who did not seem to belong in the room. Wait, Ethan said calmly. Clara paused again, the tray still balanced easily in her hands. The dining room continued its gentle rhythm around them, waiters moving between tables, the distant hum of conversation rising and falling like waves. But the small circle around Ethan's table had grown strangely focused. You said something earlier, Ethan continued, that people often ignore wisdom when it is free. Clara nodded slightly. Yes. Ethan folded his hands together. That sounds like the kind of insight people reach after watching others make expensive mistakes. Clara did not disagree. One of the venture partners leaned forward with curiosity. You talk about experience, the man said. What kind of experience teaches someone that? Clara's gaze moved briefly toward him, thoughtful but calm. The kind where the warning signs are clear, she said quietly, but nobody wants to believe them. The answer was simple, but something about the way she said it made Ethan feel the same quiet shift he had felt earlier. Markets behave the same way sometimes. The signals appeared long before the crash. Most people ignored them because accepting the truth meant changing course. You saw something like that happen, Ethan said slowly. Clara did not answer right away. She looked down at the glasses on the table and adjusted one slightly, so it lined perfectly with the plate beside it. A small, precise movement. Then she looked back at him. Yes, she said. One word again. Ethan studied her expression carefully. There was no bitterness there. No frustration. Just calm. Acceptance. The kind that usually appeared after time had passed. And you walked away, Ethan said. Clara nodded. One of the partners gave a quiet laugh. People rarely walk away from money before it disappears. Clara's eyes moved toward him again. That depends on what they value more. The man leaned back, slightly surprised by the answer. Ethan noticed something else in that moment. Clara had not once tried to turn the conversation toward herself. She answered only what was asked. Nothing more. That kind of restraint was rare in any profession, but especially rare in finance. What kind of company was it? Ethan asked. Clara hesitated just long enough to suggest she was considering how much to say. An investment firm, she replied. One of the partners smiled knowingly. Of course it was. Ethan tilted his head slightly. And what happened? Clara took a slow breath, though her calm never disappeared. The leadership believed the market would reward speed instead of discipline, she said. For a while it looked like they were right. Ethan felt a faint spark of recognition at those words. He had seen that pattern before. Fast growth. Big headlines. Short-term wins that disguised deeper problems. And you warned them, he said. Clara did not answer directly. Instead, she said something that made the entire table fall quiet again. I wrote a report, she said softly. It explained exactly how the strategy could collapse within 18 months. Ethan leaned forward slightly. What happened to the report? Clara Bennett gave the smallest hint of a smile. They told me I was too cautious. Ethan Caldwell sat back slowly, realizing that the most valuable conversation he had heard all year was happening in the middle of a dinner service, delivered by a waitress who spoke like someone who had once watched a room full of powerful people ignore the truth. The words hung quietly above the table. They told me I was too cautious. Ethan Caldwell repeated the sentence slowly in his mind, the way he often repeated numbers that did not quite make sense the first time he saw them. In his world, caution was rarely celebrated. Speed, boldness, aggressive bets, those were the qualities that filled headlines and attracted investors. But every experienced strategist understood something deeper. The markets did not punish caution. They punished arrogance. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying Clara Bennett. Again with a sharper curiosity than before. 18 months, he said thoughtfully. That was your projection. Clara nodded once. Yes. One of the partners at the table leaned forward slightly. And what happened 18 months later? Clara looked at him calmly. The firm collapsed. No one spoke for several seconds. The quiet was not dramatic, but it carried weight. Anyone sitting at that table understood what those words meant. When an investment firm collapsed, the headlines usually talked about market shifts or unexpected volatility. But people inside the industry knew the truth was almost always simpler. Someone had ignored the warning signs. Ethan rested his fingers lightly on the table. And your report explained exactly how it would happen. Clara did not answer with pride. She simply nodded again. Yes. Did they fire you? One of the partners asked. Clara shook her head. No, the man looked surprised. Then why did you leave? Clara adjusted the tray slightly in her hands. Her voice remained steady, the same calm tone she had used all evening. Because they ignored the report. Ethan tilted his head slightly. People ignore reports all the time. Clara met his gaze directly. Yes, but they also asked me to sign another one. The table grew quiet again. Ethan understood immediately what she meant. In large firms, reports were often rewritten until they supported the strategy leadership had already chosen. Risk analysis became reassurance. Warnings became footnotes. Numbers were adjusted until the outcome looked comfortable enough to approve. And you refused, Ethan said quietly. Clara nodded. Yes. One of the venture partners let out a slow breath. That must have been an expensive decision. Clara gave a faint, almost amused smile. More expensive for them. Ethan felt a quiet shift in his thoughts at that answer. Not because of the confidence, but because of the absence of bitterness behind it. Clara Bennett was not telling the story like someone who had lost everything. She spoke like someone who had already measured the cost and accepted it. When did the firm collapse? Ethan asked. Clara thought for a moment. 17 months after I left. One of the men at the table shook his head softly. You were off by 1 month. Clara's faint smile returned. Markets rarely follow exact calendars. Ethan could not help the small smile that appeared at the corner of his mouth. That answer sounded exactly like something one of his senior analysts would say during a strategy meeting. For a moment, he imagined Clara sitting at a long conference table instead of standing beside it with a tray in her hands. The image did not feel strange at all. It felt correct. Ethan tapped his finger lightly against the tablecloth as another thought formed. Tell me something, Clara, he said. When your report was ignored, and you realized what was going to happen, why did you not stay and benefit from being right? Clara Bennett considered the question carefully before answering. Then she said something so simple it made every person at the table pause again. Because being right about a collapse is not the same thing as wanting to watch it happen. Ethan Caldwell sat quietly for a moment after she spoke, realizing that the calm waitress standing beside his table had just revealed the kind of judgment most people in his industry spent entire careers trying to develop. For a moment, the table remained completely silent. Because Clara Bennett had just said something that most people in the financial world would never say out loud. Being right about a collapse is not the same thing as wanting to watch it happen. Ethan Caldwell slowly leaned back in his chair, studying her with the focused attention he usually reserved for unusual investment opportunities. Around them, the restaurant continued its calm rhythm. Glasses clinked softly. A waiter passed with a tray of desserts. The piano near the bar moved gently into a slower melody. But at Ethan's table, the conversation had shifted into something far more interesting than business deals. One of the venture partners finally broke the silence with a quiet laugh. You walked away from a firm before it collapsed. You predicted the timeline almost exactly, and now you are serving dinner in Manhattan. That might be the most unusual career path I have heard all year. Clara did not seem offended by the remark. If anything, she appeared mildly amused. Life reorganizes priorities sometimes, she said calmly. Ethan tapped his finger lightly against the edge of his glass. His mind was already moving through possibilities the way it always did when he encountered something unusual. Analysts with Clara's judgment were rare. Analysts who also had the discipline to walk away from a failing strategy were even rarer. What happened after you left? Ethan asked. Clara adjusted the tray slightly against her arm before answering. The firm issued 3 more positive outlook reports during the following year, she said. Each one insisted the strategy would recover. One of the partners shook his head knowingly. Let me guess. Investors believed them. Clara nodded. For a while. Ethan could already imagine the rest of the story. Money continued flowing in. Confidence grew louder. Warning signs were ignored until they became impossible to hide. It was a pattern every experienced investor recognized. When the collapse happened, Ethan asked quietly, "Did anyone contact you?" Clara considered the question for a moment. Yes. Ethan raised an eyebrow. To apologize? Clara gave a small smile. To ask if I would return and help fix it. The partner who had been laughing earlier leaned forward in surprise. You are serious? Clara nodded once. Yes. Ethan watched her carefully. And what did you say? Clara looked at him with the same steady calm she had shown since the beginning of the conversation. I said no. The table grew quiet again. One of the men shook his head slowly. Most people would have taken the offer. Clara's voice remained gentle but firm. Most people would have ignored the report in the first place. Ethan felt a faint spark of respect forming behind his curiosity. That answer revealed something deeper than intelligence. It revealed principles. And in his industry, principles were far more valuable than clever predictions. Ethan glanced briefly at the other men at the table. They were all thinking the same thing he was thinking. The calm waitress standing beside them spoke with the clarity of someone who had already sat through boardroom discussions most analysts would never be invited into. Ethan turned his attention back to Clara. "You know," he said slowly, "there are a lot of investment firms in this city." Clara nodded. "Yes. And some of them would pay very well for someone who can see problems 17 months before they happen." Clara's faint smile returned. "That may be true." Ethan studied her for another moment before asking the question that had quietly formed in his mind several minutes earlier. "So tell me something, Clara Bennett," he said thoughtfully. "If you walked away from that world, why are you still studying it so closely?" Clara looked at him for a moment, and when she answered, her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had already thought about the question many times. "Because understanding the game," she said softly, "is not the same thing as wanting to play it again." The answer settled over the table like a quiet echo. Understanding the game is not the same thing as wanting to play it again. Ethan Caldwell looked at Clara Bennett with a new level of attention, the kind that appeared only when he realized something in front of him was far more valuable than it first seemed. In the financial world he lived in, people rarely walked away voluntarily. They stayed for the bonuses, the recognition, the promise that the next deal might be the one that made them famous. Clara Bennett had done the opposite. She had stepped away even after proving she understood the system better than the people running it. One of the venture partners shook his head slowly. "You predicted a collapse 17 months in advance," he said. "Most analysts would build an entire career on that kind of call." Clara adjusted the tray slightly against her arm. "Predictions only matter if people listen," she said calmly. Ethan leaned forward again, resting his hands on the table. Something about her answers had triggered the analytical part of his mind that never truly turned off. "Your report," he said thoughtfully. "Do you still have it?" Clara looked at him for a moment before answering. "Yes." One of the men at the table raised his eyebrows. "You kept it?" Clara nodded once. "It was my work." Ethan's curiosity sharpened further. In finance, documentation was everything. Models, projections, analysis. If Clara Bennett still had the report that predicted a major collapse, it meant she had evidence of the judgment she described so calmly tonight. "Do you ever read it again?" Ethan asked. Clara gave a faint smile. "Sometimes." "Why?" She answered without hesitation. "To remind myself that being correct does not always change the outcome." The table grew quiet again. Ethan recognized the truth behind that sentence immediately. Markets ignored logic all the time. Investors ignored logic even more often. The ability to see the truth early did not guarantee anyone would listen to it. One of the partners leaned forward, curiosity growing. "Do you know how much money people would pay to read that report today?" Clara's smile remained soft. "Probably more than $100. Ethan could not help the quiet laugh that escaped him. She had just circled the entire evening back to the moment where the conversation began. A single $100 bill offered as a joke. And now the entire table understood that the advice he had purchased for that price had come from someone who had once written an analysis capable of saving millions. Ethan rested back in his chair again, his expression thoughtful. "You know something interesting, Clara," he said. "Earlier tonight, I asked you to sell me your best advice." Clara nodded. "Yes." Ethan gestured lightly toward the bill she had placed in her apron pocket. "But the more you speak, the more it becomes clear that I may have purchased something far more valuable than a single sentence." Clara did not appear impressed by the observation. Instead, she glanced once more across the restaurant floor, where another table was quietly waiting for service. Responsibility first. Conversation second. Ethan noticed that again. Discipline revealed itself in small habits. "Mr. Caldwell," she said politely, "my other tables are waiting." Ethan watched her for a moment longer, recognizing that the conversation could easily end right here if he allowed it. The waitress would return to work. The billionaire would return to his dinner. And the story would disappear into the background of another evening in Manhattan. But Ethan Caldwell had built his entire career on recognizing moments most people ignored. And this felt like one of those moments. Clara Bennett remained standing beside the table, her tray balanced calmly against her arm, while Ethan Caldwell considered the moment in front of him. In business, he had learned that timing mattered as much as opportunity. Some moments appeared quietly, disguised as ordinary conversations, and disappeared just as quickly if no one recognized their value. The restaurant around them continued its gentle rhythm, but Ethan knew something unusual had just happened at his table. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small card holder. The movement was slow and deliberate, the way he handled decisions that mattered. Clara watched politely, but did not lean closer or show curiosity. She simply waited. Ethan placed a clean white business card on the table beside the empty water glass. The name Ethan Caldwell was printed in simple dark lettering, followed by the title Chief Executive Officer and the name of one of the largest investment firms in the country. One of the venture partners smiled knowingly as he watched. He had seen that gesture before. Ethan rarely offered his direct contact information. Clara Bennett, Ethan said calmly. Earlier tonight, I offered you $100 for advice. Clara nodded slightly. Yes. Ethan tapped the card gently with one finger. Now I would like to offer something else. Clara did not reach for the card. She did not react with excitement or surprise. She simply looked at him with the same calm attention she had shown throughout the evening. Ethan noticed that again. In a city where people chased opportunity constantly, she behaved like someone who understood that real opportunities did not require chasing. My company hires analysts, Ethan continued. People who study patterns, evaluate risk, and tell the truth even when it is inconvenient. One of the partners chuckled softly, which is rarer than it should be. Ethan ignored the comment. His eyes remained on Clara. You predicted a financial collapse 17 months in advance, he said. You refused to sign a report you believed was wrong. And you walked away from a position that most people would have protected at any cost. He paused for a moment before finishing the thought. Those are not common qualities. Clara listened quietly. Then she said something that made the offer feel different from the beginning. You do not know me, Mr. Caldwell. Ethan gave a small smile. I know enough to be curious. The card remained on the table between them. Clara looked at it for a moment, but still did not reach forward. And if I say no? She asked calmly. Ethan's smile widened slightly. Then you will continue being the most overqualified waitress in Manhattan. One of the partners laughed quietly, but Clara Bennett remained thoughtful. After a moment, she gently set the tray down on the edge of the table and picked up the business card. She studied it briefly, not with excitement, but with careful consideration. Then she slipped it into the same apron pocket where the $100 bill rested. Ethan watched her reaction closely. Does that mean you will call? He asked. Clara lifted the tray again and gave a faint smile that carried the same quiet confidence as her first sentence of the evening. It means, she said softly, that good advice should change how people think, not just where they work. Ethan Caldwell sat back in his chair, realizing that the most valuable lesson he had heard all night had not come from a boardroom presentation or a financial report. It had come from a waitress who never raised her voice, never tried to impress him, and still managed to change the way everyone at the table saw the room around them.